technology knowledge within the region. So it isn't just going there, doing the project and leaving. It's really how do you make that sustainable and last on the ground, wherever that project may be. So just kind of a glance, the majority of the folks that work at NVIDIA are originally from Silicon Valley, technologists. The three founders, as well as myself, all came out of Silicon Valley working. And at some point in our career, it became aware, it's great we develop this new widget thing that's going to make AT&T more money, but is that really what you want to do with your life? And so we got to the point, well, how do we actually develop this thing that's going to really make an impact and help people's lives, just not corporate profits? And so after 17 years at Sun Microsystems and a year at Oracle, I decided it's time to find out my background somewhere else. And my background is mechanical engineering from Michigan Technological University and international business from the University of Wisconsin. So it's kind of my background education. One of the things that really made NVIDIA successful has been our ICT Entrepreneur Partner Program. For NVIDIA certified. And so we have that now in over 20 countries that we work on the ground to train, such as here is Bob March, one of our co-founders, training some local families to really train them on how we approach low-cost wireless networking, how we approach sustainable computing, and apply it in those regions. And I'll give you a few examples of that. And so, why ICT? Well, I'm sure you've been learning, ICT has grown, in my view, has really moved from a sector to a tool. And if we look at any area of development, whether it's healthcare, education, agriculture, aid support, ICT is an important tool to make those things happen in those regions. And so one of our very first projects we did was in northern Uganda with Father Joe, a Catholic priest there. And what he wanted to do was interlink his parishes with the parish schools and out into the community with internet connectivity so that they could communicate better with the communities, especially at that time where there was a lot of civil strife happening in northern Uganda, and be able to communicate and keep those communities safe that were part of his parish and church. And we're kind of proud of that, what we did there, because that network, as well as the computer labs that have gone into schools, have been up and running now for over 7 years. It's been that's kind of an exciting project just to see how long the sustainability part of it that's lasted. So we're not a big NGO like some of the large agencies that work with USAID and other large organizations. But we tend to work with a lot of those funded agencies as a subcontractor handling the ICT needs of those projects wherever they are in the world. So we work and serve with a lot of different organizations, specifically addressing how do they make ICT sustainable on those projects. And our local partners are key to success. And so our projects come to us from two different directions. Either it's an aid agency coming to us, or a government agency saying, we've got a need in this certain area, can you help? Or it's our partners that we've trained that have said, hey, there's this opportunity, can you help us? And a good example was in the Congo, where there's an agency rolling out microfinance, but they didn't have any internet communications to link where they wanted to put their microfinance offices into those communities. And so our partner came to us and said, hey, can you help us design a wireless network to connect those together? And so we work closely with our partner to roll out that specific infrastructure for that in-country microfinance. Or such as in Uganda, training, they wanted to put Linux solution labs in several communities. And once again, we worked with our local partners to design, deploy, and support that. And a good example of this is we just last year finished up 900 solar-powered computer labs with internet connectivity for schools in Tanzania. We didn't do all 900. We have the contract to do that, but we worked with our local partner that we certified. We designed and engineered what needed to go in those schools with what local solar, what we could buy locally on the local market with solar panels, charge controllers, batteries, etc. Did that design, did the first 20 schools together, then spot checked a few schools after that, and then our partner is the one that actually went and did all, the next 850 schools. And so we spend a lot of time training those local partners on how to properly support, how to put a ticketing system in, how to support and maintain when these systems have issues, and do proper support so that these projects do have long sustainability. Yes?
So you mentioned that you start off with your first few projects and then hand it off to the train.
Yes.
And I was wondering, when you do first start off, you mentioned that you do the planning based off the available equipment, or do you bring your own equipment there? And I'm just wondering, when you're creating these infrastructure, do you ship it over, or do you build it with what it is you build?
And that really varies country to country. And I'll give you a good example. Like these monitors that you see here on the screen, we couldn't find LCD monitors that use very low power that ran on 12 volts, because 12 volts is critical, because if you want to power it off a solar solution, you have 12, 24, 48 volts. Well, guess what? Every monitor you find on the market here runs at 19 volts. So how do you easily use that in these low resource environments, especially when you have a solar powered school? And to use something off the shelf that you find then would require, now we've got to add an inverter, and we have to worry about maintaining that. It's added more cost to the project, and we have losses with that inverter. Well, why can't we just run that whole lab directly with DC and eliminate all those other failure pieces? And so there's a case where we actually took our requirements to a Chinese manufacturer, and we sourced several container full of these type of monitors that were designed to be in dusty, humid conditions that ran at 12 volts and used very low energy. And through our ISIPs, then they can order those through us. So there's a case where we actually drop shipped from China to the project because we couldn't buy it locally. Now, with that said, that was 6 years ago. Now, in places like Uganda, the local market has gotten smart, and because they've lost so much business, that guess what? Now you can in Kampala go into and buy that type of monitor. The same thing with low power PCs. We couldn't find any in those local markets, so we sourced them and shipped them in. But now you can in those local markets. So it changes all the time. We don't want to be in the hardware business, but in times that we had to. So we do want to source as much locally as possible. But if it's not local, can we find it? If we can't find it, then we actually, like in the case of the monitors, designed a specification, found a manufacturer that would build to that spec.
What was the time scale for you to design and engineer the initial batch, and then versus the time it took for you to train these people to teach the intention how to do it themselves and maintain it and support it? What was the time range?
Well, every project's different, so I'm not sure what.
I'm talking about this particular the PCs.
For the low power monitors, that was about a 3-month effort on our part to get what we needed and get pricing and everything worked out with the manufacturer in China. And then to design these labs, and really what we do is we have 2 trainings that we put our partners through. One is building out low-cost wireless networks, and then the second one is on sustainable computing and teaching them about solar energy, about that there is other options other than that big Dell desktop that somebody wants to always try to sell them. And what that means as far as support and maintenance and where to find those things. And then the third part of the training, which is, so these are all 2-week courses. The third part is how to run as a small business operator. Because we can go into these rural communities and find like an ICT entrepreneur, but they don't have any business skills to do, well, how do I actually put a proposal together and go after a new project? So we found we had to have, we had to do a business training for them also. But more like a small entrepreneur training. So, you know, not just the technology, but how do you be successful, how can you be successful as a small business operator in these rural communities?
So when we spoke about the Dell computers, typically in the rural areas I have observed that people tend to buy the technology or the hardware supplies from a trusted vendor, even if it means paying more in some projects. So how did you go about like selling the new specifications, like newly modeled machines in this case? How did you, what were the challenges that you faced?
Well, it was really educating the person funding the project why this was important.
Okay.
And not trying to predefine a certain solution. And I'll give you a good example. You know, I know there's hundreds of examples of where this has failed. And a good example was I was working on in Haiti where they're rolling out laptops to schools, and the project manager wanted to put some small servers at the school to house content. So he went back to the Minister of Education and said, okay, I've got these 20 schools, I want to put little servers in to house content, and they said, oh great, we'll get purchasing right on it. The next time I showed up, they had these huge rack-mounted servers that dropped off at these schools that were big Dell data center servers at schools that had no electricity. And you know, it was just they were buying things, you know, that they didn't, you know, oh, this is what we always buy for the Minister of Education for our data center need. It's called the server, so that's what they, you know, spent $4,000 a piece on these servers for schools. It just, nobody thought through it.
Yeah, I've observed that. So people, and at least the projects that I have seen, they tend to think that Dell means rugged, and
Right.
that's like an equation that has formed over the years. So.
Right, and you know, and I've, you know, and here's one of the little solutions that we promote, which is this is a content server for a school that can support about 10 students, and there's, you know, all the Khan Academy videos on here, all other content, and here's a little standalone server that costs less than $100. And you know, the organization that develops the content for this, called World Possible, you know, they've shipped over 5,000 of these. And here's something that uses 2 watts of power, not like the big server that ended up in Haiti that was using 300 watts a piece. You know, you could easily, for under 2 watts, do this. This is what they needed. So this is, I plugged this in, and if you want to look at the content on it, you just have to connect to SSID RPI, and then point your browser at 192.168.10.1. And you can look at the content that's on there. And you know, that for a small school, that's the type of innovative things that you need to look at.
Just out of curiosity, how much is that?
Well, that's based on a Raspberry Pi, so it's like $68 with the housing and SD card and everything. So, you know, a big part of our success that I always say is that local capacity that we build. So we've built this certified program. We've had over 125 companies that we've certified, and we build out that local capacity. So when, in fact, now when somebody wants to do a project in Nigeria, a lot of times they just go to our website, look at our 5 certified partners in Nigeria, and they work with them directly. And a lot of times don't even know they're doing a project. But what we're trying to do is help them get access to new clients and the correct equipment. And a lot of these are 1 or 2 person organizations, and an entrepreneur that's trying to build his business in that rural area. And he can't, you know, if he were to win a project for, 5 schools, for example, most of the time to buy equipment locally that Dell, they want 50% down just to place the order, and there's no way he can get that capital. And so if they're a certified partner with us, we actually would actually order that and supply him that equipment until he gets paid. So we help them both on a business standpoint to be viable. So I'm sure, one of the things that you've been learning, of course, I hope, is what are the challenges as you do ICT on the ground in these developing regions? Question?
Sorry, before, I was wondering how long does this training take and how much basic skills do the people have? I mean, I imagine that this is a whole new world of information. Like, I don't even know what it is that you just wrote on the board. So when you're training the people in the field, what are the basics? Do you require the basics? How long does it take?
Well, typically they would be someone that has ICT skills and they have a desire to work in the rural area. And because, part of the problem in most of these countries is if you do have that skill, you end up going to the capital city because that's where the jobs are. And you can't stay in your local village and actually have a job. And so part of the challenge for us is finding that person in that that wants to have that business in that rural area, but build it up so he can have a living and work so he doesn't have to live in the capital city.
And how long does it take to train that person?
As I said, our training, we go through 6 weeks, 2 weeks on connectivity or how to build out low-cost wireless networks. So essentially, how do I, from point A to point B, get an internet connection there? The second is on sustainable computing, which covers both renewable energy systems as well as, why that big Dell desktop isn't the right thing for that project. What alternatives are available, and how do you design and specify those? And then the last piece is we do a 2-week, I'll say, entrepreneurial training class so that they understand how to stay in business, how to do, how to do ordering, how to do invoicing, how to do marketing and sales. Because that's really, as we got into this, it wasn't just about the technical training, it was the training how to actually have the mechanics of staying in business.
We answered this a little bit, and coming from somebody who worked for one of the video partners, what makes, or what other qualifiers are besides like they want to stay in the rural setting and they have an interest that makes them, qualify for a video partnership training?
Well, that one, they want that they have ICT experience to begin with, that they have the knowledge base to build from.
Okay. Is there any worry that they're going to be able to leverage that to like have market power and therefore, maybe they'll use those skills to just cater towards the higher end customers there, or is it because you're dealing in the rural area you don't really have that problem?
Well, part of their recertification is looking at which projects they've been doing and supporting.
Okay.
So, if they did 0 projects in a year, they wouldn't be an Invideo partner. If they went and did just those, if they moved to the capital city and only did big projects for the Minister of Education in their office building, they wouldn't stay on as a partner because their commitment to helping in the rural area and having a business that's thriving in the rural area, it's got lost somewhere along the line.
Is that done like once a year or how often?
Once a year.
Regarding the product or the whole process of developing a new product geared towards a particular market or a specific need, like do you kind of do the needs assessment first, or like how do you identify the solution would probably fit and then go about doing the pilots? I know it's like too many questions clubbed together, but like how do you productize it?
Well, we look at 5 key areas when we go in. One is what's the correct hardware for that project? The second is what's the correct operating system or applications needed to support there. Third is there proper training for the end users that are going to be using that solution that's been planned and budgeted for. Fourth, is there local support? And five, do all these things take into account the environment that's there and the infrastructure that's in that region, because all of these things are different. And I'll take a good example. If we built a wireless network in Haiti and I use this to connect that Wi-Fi device outside, this cable would last less than 6 months in Haiti. One, the UVs would break the cable down. And second, the connectors would be corroded because of the high salt content air. So you need to spend that extra $1 per cable to have the ones that have the gold-plated connectors, or you're going to be replacing that cable every 6 months. And if you've got agreement to connect that radio on top of a tower, and you've got to get special permission to access it, it's foolish not to spend that extra $1 for that cable to last a lot longer. So, you really have to look at what the environment that it's going into and the infrastructure. And the same with the infrastructure, just like my example for the server in Haiti, this thing, uses 2 watts of power, which easily could be solar powered, compared to that big server at 300 watts. That's got to have an air-conditioned room, has to have conditioned power. The whole infrastructure is going to fail. It's going to fail because the infrastructure is not there to support it. So these are the 5 key things that we look at on every project, and then try to determine, how does that fit in. So like the one here, the challenge that we have to deal with are, the power issue. In most of these areas, either the grid power is really bad and you get really high swings in voltage that burns out a power supply in a computer very quickly, or you've got to deal with heat, dust, and humidity. That big Dell computer's got a fan running in it, and it's going to be sucking in dusty air all day long. It's going to fail in a year because the dust is going to clog stuff up and it's going to overheat. Where if you have a passively cooled system without a fan, it's going to last a lot longer. And as well as internet connectivity. One of the sorry things that I'm seeing in the marketplace now with the big NGOs is they've sitting here in the Western world. Oh, here's this huge app for tracking AIDS-related cases. We put that out into the cloud, but you need a 3 gigabit connection to the internet to use that cloud app. And I'm sitting here in a healthcare clinic in northern Kenya, and I'm lucky to get internet once a week. And they're wondering, why are you uploading all your data to the cloud? Well, or there's a misconnect between what's happening in these aid agencies in the headquarters and what's needed in the field to operate. And so I know a lot of people say, well, cloud computing is going to be a great boom for markets in the developing world, and I'm saying, no, it's the worst thing that they can have. Because one, we're all the cloud experts. They're in the Western Europe and the US, so all the brains are here running it, and you need such big internet connectivity to access that stuff that those regions don't have it. So it's not a boom to those markets just because, oh, look at how inexpensive or free it is. Well, it isn't. So these are the things that we look at. So you've all heard about the OLPC, one laptop per child. I don't know if you saw recently they've just closed down their operation in Boston, in Cambridge. So how would you rate that attempt at, ICT for education?
So typically, PCs or any kind of big electronic equipment which has considerable investment, or even if it comes from a charity, it is viewed as a sacred piece, and nobody, the kids are not allowed to touch it or actually use it. And so, unless it has to augment the needs, it cannot be intrusive in any sense. So that has been my basic observation.
Well, and if I go on my chart here, they looked at, we're going to make it run at 12 volts, and we'll actually embed small charge controller into the charging system, so you can plug it directly into the solar panel, and we'll make it ruggedized, and you can drop the thing in water and it still is going to work. So, you know, they did a great job with it on the hardware. When you look at this funky Linux that they used in sugar environment and said, okay, teachers can develop their own applications. Well, these teachers have never ever used a computer, now they're going to program applications for their class? I don't think so. That's, you know, I kind of view they failed big time there. Training. Oops. There was no training available on how to use that in an educational environment. They left it up to the end users, up to the Minister of Education, the Department of Education. Support. Well, one of the saddest things I've ever seen, I went and saw an installation of OLPC in a school in northern Senegal. Went back a year later, well, what had happened? There was no infrastructure within Senegal to buy spare parts. So when one broke, they cannibalized it to fix other ones. But it got to a point, you know, there was not enough laptops. So it was actually, at that school, it was 3 kids per laptop. And, you know, the saddest thing I saw was this laptop that had a broken screen, and so you could only see half of what was on the screen, and 3 kids trying to use that laptop where they could only see half the information. And that's how they're using it every day. Because there was no plan for how do we support that in those environments, or how do we fix things, or because the headmasters, he said, well, where do I buy new screens? Well, if you lived in the US, you could order one at a price that was higher than the cost of buying the whole laptop. So there was no way to get support on these. The environment in infrastructure, once again, I'll say, you know, they shipped that laptop out and said, good luck. You know, whether you have, you know, you figure out your solar system, or you figure out how to run it on the grid, you figure out how to charge it every day. You know, so, you know, they did a great job designing the hardware, but if they really wanted to make an impact in education, ICT for E, they kind of, in my view, failed on a lot of, they just kind of threw the hardware over the ocean and said, good luck. So, and that's why we see a lot of projects fail in ICT for D, because, you know, hardware's been thrown over the ocean to inexperienced users and administrators, or it was expensive or the inappropriate solution for that, and there's no professional support for that. So unless the project addresses those 5 key critical things, you know, good luck with on that being sustainable.
I may be jumping the gun in your presentation here, but what is the, what do you do once some funding runs out? So you get your funding for your project, or you do LPC have money to just ship out the laptops, and then that was their investment. But if you're trying to set up servers in a school, is there a way to make it not dependable on outside funding? You guys look into that, or how do you provide support?
Well, you know, and that's, you know, that's one of the areas that when we look at these projects, when we go into them, once again, you know, and I'll pick on, you know, if something comes across and the donors already said, oh yeah, we want all, you know, iPads in this school in Africa, I'm going to say, I'm not interested, because that's doomed failure right there, because for an iPad to work in Africa, you have to have an Apple account. And if you don't have an email address, you can't get an Apple account. If you don't have a credit card from a Western bank, either in Western Europe or North America, you can't, or Asia, you can't get an Apple account. And, you know, it's interesting, I've seen so many projects where they've taken these in and said, oh, there's hundreds of applications for this school that they can download, you know. Well, none of those apps fit in that African school, and they can't get access to them anyway. So, you know, it's the wrong hardware to start with. But to answer your question, you know, what we look at is, has there been enough money allocated to train the end users, to train administrators in that local market. Is there money to build that local capacity that can do that professional IT support long term? Not just for the pilot, but actually what happens a year after this thing's installed? Who's going to do the long-term support to make sure it's still up and running? So those are the characteristics that we look for in these projects. And I'm going to back up a couple slides and just give you a good example. Like this project in northern Uganda with Father Joe, what made that successful is he actually teamed with, while he's a faith-based organization, he teamed with the University of Notre Dame out of Indiana to help support his project. And they actually have a program at the university where 2 students go over, one out of social science, one out of engineering or computer science, go over every 6 months and help support and maintain and keep the project fresh, so to speak. And through their partnership with the University of Notre Dame, they've been able to keep their people trained, to keep someone fresh coming in to look at how to keep this operating and the training and local support done correctly. So, those are the things that we look for. What innovative thing has the funder been looking at to keep it sustainable? And there's not, every project's different on how that's going to be approached. Whether they, figure out a way to, we've done about 60 solar-powered schools in Haiti to date, and there's a group of those schools that couldn't afford the internet connectivity on a long-term basis, but they've opened the school up in the evening to train people. And so they're teaching basic classes on Word, on internet access, on social media, and through that income, they're able to pay for their internet connectivity and have long-term sustainability for that lab. So there's a lot of different models that will work to do that. So any questions on these challenges?
I have a question. You mentioned, you spoke about lack of affordable internet connectivity. That problem is still very relevant.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so how do you work around with this problem? Like, how do you design a product to work around for this problem? As a workaround for this problem?
Well, and that's a case of looking where, what's the most affordable means to get internet connectivity at the best affordable price. The first, in these rural areas, a lot of people think, I've got to put a VSAT in, but the cost of that bandwidth over satellite is really expensive. Is there another way to get connectivity there? Can we build out a point-to-point Wi-Fi network? A large project we're working on right now in northern Uganda, near where Father Joe's located, is building out a point-to-point Wi-Fi network backbone from Gulu all the way up to the South Sudan border. Because Oxfam out of the Netherlands is putting in these 100 ICT training and work centers, and they need to have them all connected to the internet. So we've designed and built out, right now we've got the first 20 done, on how to connect those. To put a VSAT out of every one, the project wouldn't have been affordable. But what they did is convince the Ugandan Telecom to run a fiber optics cable to Gulu, and then from that point, we built out internet connectivity up to the South Sudan border.
So there are multiple stakeholders and
Yes.
a lot of bureaucratic processes.
Every project's different, depending on what they need. But the good thing with this project is USAID had funded 15 healthcare clinics that also needed internet connectivity in that region, and now they're going to tie into the network. So most of the time, there is demand in the rural areas for internet connectivity, and most of the ISPs in these countries don't see that. And one of the large projects that I wanted to talk about was the network we built out in Haiti. We built out a wireless network to cover 20% of rural Haiti. And the reason we did that was there was a lot of NGOs operating in the rural area, a lot of businesses, governments, but the there's like 6 ISPs within Port-au-Prince, but they said there's no business in the rural area. So we built out this network into our test area, and in the first month, those ISPs had signed up $100,000 worth of connectivity contracts that they didn't know existed. We built the network out to cover the 20%, and within the first year, they had signed over $1 million in internet connectivity. The business they didn't even know was there. So in most of these cases, it's it's actually showing them that there is a business and there is a model. Our goal is not to run and operate a network in Haiti, but it was to show them there is business there, and Mr. ISPs, you should be doing this. So, I talked about hardware already, but this is, the things that we focus on is making sure it's the right hardware. Low power, but still gives good performance, and building out wireless networks, once again, that use low power but have good performance. We work with our ISIPs, our local partners, and train them on the software that's needed to support, whether it's Microsoft or Linux installations, doing SMS integration, or just plain network management. And then also on the power, how do you power a school, whether it's batteries and a solar installation, maybe it's a combination between power and batteries for outages, or maybe it's just, if they've got grid power, just protecting them from the voltage swings, and training them on how to do these things properly. So I mentioned Haiti. So what our work actually started there right when the earthquake had hit, and all the NGOs had no internet connectivity. And so we went in 3 days after the earthquake had hit, and actually started building out point-to-point wireless networks to tie in all the aid agencies that were trying to do support on the ground in Port-au-Prince. And this is where, in some of the rural areas where we started building out networks, and the ISPs didn't have coverage, and that's where we had then gone to Google.org, as well as the Clinton Bush Foundation and a few others, and said, hey, provide some funding, and we're going to build out this rural network to show that there is opportunity and business in those rural areas, so that we can grow internet connectivity into rural Haiti. Just to kind of go back to this a little bit, the other thing that we get a lot of calls from our NGOs, or small NGOs, that have gone and tried to do good projects, and they have failed dramatically. Just say, one that just happened 2 months ago, there's a gentleman out of Washington, D.C., formed his own little foundation with his friends, said we're going to help schools in Haiti and take computers. So they gathered up 5,000 used corporate laptops, wiped them clean, put on Linux and all the free Linux software they could get their hands on, and said, great, we're going to go take these to schools in Haiti, and that's what they went and did. And they went back 6 months later, and none of them were even being used. And they're like, what did we do wrong? Here's this other school that Invinio was involved in, and there's kids in there using it every day. What's the difference? Well, what they didn't know was in Haiti, to get a job, you have to have this certificate that says you know how to use Windows, Microsoft Windows, not Linux. You have to know how to use Microsoft Office, not OpenOffice or other open source kind of software. And so, those students said, why do I want to use this? It's not going to help me get a job. The other thing is on the training, I'm going to put the little, they thought, oh, we'll get the best people that know about computers and Linux. And they went to Virginia Tech, recruited grad students out of the computer science department, flew them down to train these Haitian teachers on how to use these computers in the classroom. Well, those grad students were computer science grad students. They didn't know anything about training teachers. They didn't speak Creole. They didn't speak French. And they had allocated a half a day per school to train these teachers. So so it was very obvious why these schools weren't using those computers.
So, like, do you formulate the training plan and the support plan like during your assessment period or for a
Yes.
partner or?
And a lot of that's been, what we've learned on the ground on how to do these. Just like when we first started doing the computer labs in Haiti, we knew we needed someone that could teach the teachers in Creole. So we found a teacher that was very computer savvy and hired him and worked with him to put a training curriculum together. And now when he trains teachers to use computers in the school, it's actually a 2-week training course. And he goes back and does a 4-day follow-up about a month later. And that's been a very successful model because they're being trained in their language on a platform that the students know they can get a certificate and a job afterwards on.
So quick question, this project is about, so the students go into Haiti knowing that Invenio has implemented this project, were they taking it off what you guys have done, trying to bring it to another school?
No, they didn't know we were down there working.
They didn't know?
No.
Oh, okay.
They learned, they were just, when they went back to see that they weren't being used, and then somebody said, well, this other school has computers they use all the time. They went there, and they were like, why are they using their computers here and not ours? And they said, well, call Invenio to see how they did that, and that's what they did.
Because that's what they should have done in the beginning if they knew.
Right. Well, and once again, it's knowing, it's knowing the environment that you're going into and what's needed, and making the right investments in these areas so that you have that long-term sustainability.
So, like in situations like these where you work with first responders like Network, so how do you plan beforehand that you probably will need so many devices, or you need to set up so many devices? How do you plan ahead?
Well, in this case, that was hard because it was a disaster. And so, in fact, we went in with 2 tons of equipment, not knowing what we needed. Just like we just responded to and sent engineers over to reestablish internet connectivity in the Philippines for the typhoon that went through last November. And it was the same thing, we don't know. But in that case, we had the luxury, we sent 2 engineers for 2 weeks that did the on-the-ground assessment in November, and then we went back with the equipment we needed in December. But in fact, that was a good case of where there was distributors of the proper equipment in Manila, so we didn't actually take it back. We actually bought it from a local supplier in Manila and had them ship it into the disaster area when our engineers arrived.
So you need to do that market research as well.
Yes.
If I had a question on the same line, like what are the key learnings when you try to implement such projects in disaster areas or for the war-torn countries? Like, what are the key challenges and the lessons?
Well, it's really understanding what's needed on the ground. And, our focus is on, ICT. It's what can we go and do best? A good example, when we first went to the Philippines, we thought it would be establishing internet connectivity. But when we got there, what we found out was because all the communications were down, all the aid agencies were running around with paper maps that were 5 years old, and with with roads that were wiped out or buildings that collapsed into streets. You couldn't always find the best route to send food, water, or medical. And so what we did in the Philippines was quite different because we said they need up-to-date maps. So we actually, there's an agency that was actually doing up-to-date maps, but nobody had access to them. And Google had redirected their satellite and got imagery right after the typhoon had hit, but guess what? Nobody had access to Google Maps because there was no internet connectivity. So we worked with an organization called OpenStreetMaps. We loaded the most current mapping information on Google Nexus tablets and took 50 of those over and distributed them to the aid agencies so that their drivers would have up-to-date maps as they're trying to work in those areas. So that's what our first response was, actually getting them up-to-date information offline on tablets, but and then when we went back and right after Christmas, then it was actually reestablishing internet connectivity for the medical workers and for the food distribution agencies that were on the ground.
I had a question about your partnerships, and maybe you mentioned and I understood, and I'm sure it also differs by project. But I imagine now you probably, after 8 years, get approached in certain situations and invited to come work. But in the beginning, maybe, and maybe even now, how do you establish new partnerships? So, for instance, with Haiti, how did you decide to go and help establish the Wi-Fi network?
Well, that was the case, because we saw when we went and did this work on the ground what was lacking. And just like in the Philippines, we see there's more work that we could be doing. And we're talking to the agencies to fund that work because we see there's more that can be done on the recovery. Not, now that the disaster relief has happened, now how do you do the recovery long term and get solid communications in those areas that were affected? I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Well, I'm trying to imagine because there are disasters, bigger and smaller ones happening all the time. There's more, silent long-term disasters that happen all the time in rural areas, for instance. So I wonder how you choose where you get involved. And so did you look at the Philippines and decide, okay, we see a problem exists and we want to go get involved and try to find a solution?
No, actually what happened there was the United Methodist Church approached us and said, can you help with our aid relief? We have a UN Corps Crisis on Relief agency based there. They're trying to help with this disaster, but we can't get our trucks where we need them to go. And they asked us to come and help them. Once we got there, we started working also with the UN Emergency Communication Organization, as well as other NGOs on the ground, and saw a bigger need. So that one started out by us being invited by an organization that needed some help. So you're right, if I saw tomorrow's news that, there was a tsunami that's hit, like it did in Japan, we're not going to fly over there and say, what can we do to help? We wait till we're invited by someone.
Okay.
And sometimes we turn it down if we don't have expertise that can help. Our expertise is in, ICT for D, not in food distribution, it's not in medical, etc.
And how strict are you about your 4D definition? So for instance, if, after Hurricane Sandy, for example, you were approached, would that be something, even though it's in the global north, would you still consider starting?
And for aid relief, yes. But if it's a school in rural Louisiana, that we would say, no, we're not competing with the commercial businesses within the U.S. to do that. In these places that we're working, like rural Haiti, for us to work with a local ICT entrepreneur to build out these networks, we're not competing against a commercial entity at all because they don't exist in those areas. So that's kind of our definition. We're not going to go somewhere where there's already established commercial business that can handle the need. So here's another, another project that we're invited in to put in a solar-powered broadband network and computing and voice over IP to connect schools, clinics, and also their microfinance. So here's a typical example, and once again, we look at, do these components, exist within that project before we actually sign on and go and do that project. And we've also done a lot of refugee camps. The most latest one, that whole area along the Somali-Kenya border in Dadaab, we were asked last year to help get better internet connectivity because none of the aid workers could actually communicate with each other. And so we worked in Dadaab to actually set up solar-powered community centers where the aid workers and people looking for family could interact. And so the aid agencies not only could communicate back to their headquarters, but also between each other, because that's, they're stretched about 250 kilometers along that border, and with 500,000 people, the communication isn't that good. So these are some of the other projects that we do, but once again, looking at are the aid agencies that are trying to work here have the right components to do it right. And if they don't, will they let us educate them and convince them that there's a better way to do it?
Bruce, does Invenio make your own hardware, or do you source it from various vendors?
Well, when we first got started, just like the LCD monitor, we spec'd it and then sourced it through a Chinese supplier, and they built to what we needed. The same as we hunted out low-powered computing. The good news is a lot of that stuff has come on the market now, and now we are more doing testing and evaluation, of different brands and different models, not actually going and speccing it and having it built to our specs anymore.
I see.
Because there's enough of it has come onto the market. Which is good, because we didn't want to be in the hardware business.
Right, because the initial reputation for Invenio was, hardware infrastructure folks.
Right.
In the early days. So.
Yeah, because they didn't exist.
Right.
And so we had to do that.
Mm-hmm.
How are we doing on time?
10 more minutes?
10 more minutes? Well, maybe I'll, rather than showing these examples, I'll jump kind of what we're working on today. Two areas that we're working on. One is looking at using drones for emergency relief, and it became very apparent in the Philippines, if we could have just put a drone up that was a flying hotspot and provided immediate internet connectivity for these aid agencies rather than taking a week to plan out and build a network, this would be a very good temporary fix. So we're looking at what's really possible. Can we put something up in the air that can stay up there for 4 to 5 hours that can provide that connectivity in these kind of aid situations? Now, I know a lot of people, Google has their big balloons that have been flying around, and we just saw that Facebook bought some solar-powered airplane company to do the same type of thing. We're looking at a lot more micro level. That we got this 1 square mile area in a disaster. Now, how can we get immediate internet coverage to that area? And so we just kicked off in 2014 a project doing that. And how do we put a small solar-powered battery drone up there and have it stay stationary in an area for 4 to 6 hours. The other thing that we're doing are looking at these small micro data centers and solar powering those. As a lot of these projects have started to grow up where this little Raspberry Pi doesn't really have enough power, but now we're seeing more ARM processors that use very little energy but are very high performance going into data centers. How can we take advantage of what's happened in the commercial space and actually design these solar-powered micro data centers that can go into these rural regions and survive? And so we've got funding to do one in Chuuk, Micronesia, which is in the middle of the Pacific, North Pacific, very high salt content air, no air conditioning, very bad power grid. And how can we put one of these there to support the Department of Education with the content and the training materials they want to support for the schools? And so we've actually, so that project is funded, but gone to ARM to do the design challenge, and we're going to open it up to their design engineers and say, okay, if we have a target of this has to be a repeatable solution and not cost more than $40,000, what's the best design to do that? And so next month we're launching this design competition down in Silicon Valley to come up with a micro data center, which essentially is just one rack of servers that's solar powered, but is the best design. And we think there's some innovative things that can be done to have the energy system talking to the computer system and managing that, okay, we just had a week of bad rainstorms, okay, there's some certain services we can start shutting down, you know, so that the two systems talk to each other constantly on how much power can be used. So we think there's some real interesting design challenges. So those are one of the R&D areas that we're kicking off. Well, that one's next month. This one we've already got started on. So, and then the last area that we kicked off this year is doing some more, looking at certain market opportunities, especially in the educational space, on how to improve networking infrastructure in higher education, especially in developing markets. And so one of the things that we have been seeing are a lot of new universities, small and medium-sized, growing, that have emerged into the marketplace, especially in Africa, for example. If you look back 10 years, there's probably maybe only just under 300 universities in Africa, and now there's well over 5,000. But if you go and look at their internet connectivity and their networking on campus, it's pretty bad. So what we did was designed a robust campus wireless networking system that could go into small and medium-sized campuses. We've trained our ISIPs on how to go and sell that and market to those universities. And we kicked that off in December, and the first one was sold in Sierra Leone. So our ISIP in Sierra Leone went to a campus, sold them on the fact that they needed the backing of an engineering firm out of San Francisco that was going to help them with this. He installed it. It went so well that the president of the country actually went and saw the installation and awarded him 2 more universities to do. We've got ISIP on the ground right now. In fact, started yesterday doing a site survey on a university in the Congo, DRC, to do the same, taking that same concept and doing and improving the networking at that university. And we have our ISIPs out of Nigeria that's been on 5 universities there to do the same thing. Put in better internet connection, better wireless connectivity on campus for the students, and bandwidth management. Because the biggest thing that we have seen there is if internet connectivity comes from one of the small universities, they didn't have the networking skills, and before they know it, all that bandwidth's eaten up with BitTorrent and people downloading movies and Facebook, and what the network was put in there for the faculty and students for university usage wasn't available anymore. So the kind of long distance learning of Western universities was thrown out the window because there wasn't enough. They couldn't afford more bandwidth, but all the bandwidth they had was eaten up. But if you do proper bandwidth management, put in the right networking, those things are all, they can realize all those things if it's done right. So once again, how do we get the right hardware, the right network management, train the ISIPs on how to support and run that, and install, in the environment from a power standpoint, the right pieces. So applying the same principles, but now how do we do better wireless networking and connectivity management at these universities? Question?
Seems like a great place to connect to ICT and development. So I noticed that you don't have internships available. Is it because your applications are closed? Sources? How do people place to work with engineering learning?
Well, I would say actually we've had a lot of interns. In fact, when we built out that network in Haiti, we actually had 6 interns working on that from all different universities in the U.S. In fact, the lead one, she started Engineers Without Borders at the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus, and then she worked as an intern for us in Haiti for 6 months. And we've had interns that have gone to Uganda. I've had UC Berkeley students that have joined me on projects both in Haiti and also in Micronesia. The last one was in Micronesia. I had 2 students there. We did a big training of potential partners at the University of Guam that they participated in, and then we went and did an actual pilot installation in Chuuk, Micronesia. And those two students participated for a month on that project. So it was more than But the 6 months leading up to the project, they were quite active in planning and going through and doing all of this of what was needed on that project.
So it's project specific, because I was just going through the website and it says there's nothing available right now. Is it applications are closed, or it just depends on when you have a project?
It's on a project.
Okay.
It's mainly project driven.
Just to add on to that, one of the things that we're hoping to do is to tighten the relationship between the iSchool through the ICT4D Center. We have one here with, NGOs like Bruce's that have projects that could actually use our expertise. So, that would be forthcoming. In the meantime, though, there are some other venues at TIER, though. Are you still involved with the TIER group here?
Right, for the project in Micronesia, we went to the TIER and said, we need help with this project there. Do you have someone you can nominate? And they
Right.
nominated 2 students, and so they were involved in that project for 9 months.
And that's with computer science, so we'll try to rope you over here just a
Okay.
little bit more.
But I mean, on the related note, are you still looking for volunteers? Right?
Yes, that is correct.
So, I mean, how do we get involved more? Because I applied, I haven't really.
You take Bruce out for coffee.
Yes.
Well, just like this, I actually have 6 volunteers that I'm reviewing that will manage this challenge that we're doing with ARM in getting that design part of it done, and then they'll be invited in August when we do the installation in Micronesia to come along. So, most of the time what we want to do is involve a student or a volunteer at the beginning and then follow it through to where they can actually go in the field and see, in principle, how all these things happen.
Great. Any more questions, Bruce?
That's my last slide, just so.
Okay, well, any last questions for Bruce? Otherwise, if not,
Just a few words, Bruce. On behalf of the students, I just want to say thanks. I think one of the challenges about being with a research university like UC Berkeley is that there's a lot of very vigorous academic discussions that go on, but sometimes a disconnect with what's going on in the field. And so, actually, this is a response from the students that they want to have more practitioners come and actually talk about their work, why ICT fails and how it succeeds. And these are, the next generation of ICTDers. They have, some of them are designing their own apps, and in fact, they're submitting the grants to the DIL, of which Bruce, by the way, is on the panel.
We have a meeting this afternoon.
Might be.
I'm not on it yet.
So, as you know, Bruce is a fantastic person to get to know. I always tout Invenio as one of the, very unique success stories of a social enterprise that actually works and have scaled up very successfully. And they are just right down in the Bay Area in San Francisco at a really, really cool office and outfit. So I encourage you to keep in touch. And then, Bruce, in the meantime, we would want to have you more involved with the iSchool as well.
Okay.
So on that note, let's thank Bruce for